Now we have another topic. I think it's very important, as you know, that we have a lot of medication, new medication, and very expensive. So I think the talk will be the global challenges of new and expensive medicines. Will be presented by Professor Andy Gray, Senior Lecturer, Division of Pharmacology, the Discipline of Pharmaceutical Sciences, in the School of Health Sciences, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he's a consultant pharmacist in the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa. Welcome. So this is the, yeah.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Can I add my words of thanks to the organizers for inviting me to address you and to visit this beautiful country for the second time. It's absolutely stunning to be back here again. So my topic this afternoon is the global challenge of new and expensive medicines. And to set the scene, here was a Reuters news piece from November last year. It said drug spending tops $1 trillion on Hep C cancer therapies. So it was kind of blaming one category for how there'd been growth in global sales of medicines. So let's unpick whether that criticism is absolutely right. The story was covering the IMS Health Institute's projections for 2018, where they said between 2014 and 2018, global spending on medicines was forecast to reach nearly $1.3 trillion, or about a 30% increase on the 2013 level. And some of the areas that were blamed for that were the introduction of new specialty medicines, but also increased accessibility for patients. So parts of the world that didn't have access to medicines now were getting access. That would increase expenditure. And then lower impacts from patent expiries in developed markets. To put those figures graphically, there'd been an increase between 2008 and 2013 of around $194 billion in expenditure on medicines. But in the next 5 years, the increase was expected to be somewhere around the $300 billion mark. If we look at expenditure on medicines per capita around the world, the differences are stark. And at the moment, expenditure in the US exceeds $1,000 per person in the entire population per year. But take a look way over to the right-hand side of that slide, and you'll see how little is being spent in India per person. The two bars there show the current situation and the 2018 projection. So massive increases up to perhaps $1,400 per person per year in the US. But hold that figure of $1,400 in your mind. What has also driven global pharmaceutical expenditure has been what's called the pharmerging market. These are growing, developing countries with reasonable sized populations. You'll see the list across the bottom, Algeria down to Vietnam. And they are major drivers of global pharmaceutical growth. But what's also happening in those countries that have already got access is this increase in specialty medicines, in particular in oncology, autoimmune diseases, respiratory conditions, in the antivirals, and in the immunosuppressants. Many of these are now in oral form, so the place in which they're provided might not be ambulatory, not in hospital. And there's a growing pipeline of these innovative drugs. This is IMS Health's definition of a specialty medicine. A medicine has to fulfill at least 5 of the following 8 attributes before it can be called a specialty. Generally, it's aimed at some chronic condition, something rare, initiated by a specialist, most likely not taken orally, although some are. It might require special handling, for example, cold chain, some particularly unique distribution method or administration or paperwork. But what's really important is that it's usually pretty expensive, somewhere between $6,000 and $750,000 US per year. Some of the elements might have more relevance to the US situation. For example, that patients require assistance in getting reimbursement for it. Some of the other attributes is that because they're brand new, they're generally patent protected. That means they're available from a single supplier, and the launch price is going to be set by that supplier, usually not related to their investment or related to the cost of actual production, but related to the prices charged elsewhere for competitive products. So governments, faced with those launch prices, have limited options. They can refuse to procure or reimburse for those medicines, but will face pressure from patients and clinicians. They can try to compare the price demanded in their country with some external reference pricing source and see if they can use that to exert downward pressure on prices, or at least make sure that they're equally bad. They can apply for tiered pricing on the basis perhaps of their state of their economy or the level of pathology that they face, or they can encourage the firm to license generic versions so that they can be sold at lower prices. Also included in that armamentarium for governments is the ability to remove that patent right if they feel that the patent is being abused. So using compulsory or government use licensing, this is not something absolutely unusual. So in the US, for example, all telecommunications patents are immediately licensed to government for national security purposes. Or they can find reasons, if their local law allows it, to perhaps challenge that patent status and hence the monopoly rights that that manufacturer enjoys. The degree to which these specialty products are expected to be a strong driver varies between parts of the world. So blue there in those pie graphs is the proportion of growth that is expected to come from these specialty areas. And you'll see it's particularly important in Europe, over in North America. But IMS sticks the Middle East and Africa together, and you'll see only 7% of growth in those areas is expected to be from these biologicals. That doesn't mean that you won't be facing it. It just means on a percentage basis, that's not where the growth is coming. So let's take a practical example. And the poster child at the moment is Gilead's Sofosbuvir, sold as Sovaldi. So here's the pharmaceutical journal, the British, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society's journal, which announced that NICE, the Health Technology Agency for England and Wales, had approved the supply of Sofosbuvir. On the very same day, the Guardian newspaper carried this story saying hepatitis C drug delayed by NHS due to high cost. So the Health Technology Agency said it was affordable, and the National Health System on the very same day said we can't do it because the cost is going to be incredible. £1 billion for every 20,000 patients who need treatment. So how many patients are there? Well, the prevalence of hepatitis C also varies dramatically across the world. Some of those low prevalence countries are not because it isn't there, it's because the testing hasn't happened or the testing technology is not in place. But the very highest prevalence countries are spread around, and the reasons for those high prevalences vary dramatically. So trying to find a common factor between Bolivia, Egypt, and Mongolia is going to be somewhat difficult. But the highest prevalence in the whole world is probably in Egypt. You'll see there that apart from the places where there's no data available, for the rest of the world, at least 1% of the population is infected with hepatitis C. That's a lot of patients for a treatment which is going to cost a fortune. Hepatitis C, however, is present in a number of different genotypes, and those genotypes are dramatically different. So the trials have been done predominantly in North America and predominantly on genotype 1, and you'll see that genotype 4 dominates in Egypt, and I would expect to see a lot of genotype 4 in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa as well. So here's what NICE actually said before the PJ covered the story. They noted that this product should be used in combination with pegylated interferon and ribavirin, or ribavirin only, as stated in the package insert. That monotherapy, particularly in some of the genotypes, had not yet been tested and should only be used if the patient was unable to tolerate pegylated interferon or ribavirin. There was the cost in the United Kingdom. It was 11,660 pounds per 28-day pack of 400 milligram tablets. Now, depending on your genotype of the hepatitis that infects you, you need either a 12-week or a 24-week course, remember, with the other drugs, some of which are injectable and are difficult. So a 24-week course is going to cost £69,000. The number that is burnt into our skulls is $84,000 US. That's what's in the paper at the moment. NICE based their assessment on an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio of £17,500 per quality-adjusted life year saved. The response, if you do use the 3 drugs together in an appropriate genotype, can be as high as 92% cure rate. So if the patient is relatively young and you prevent them from progressing to fulminant liver failure requiring either a transplantation or inevitable death, then the number of life years saved is going to be considerable. However, not all patients who are infected develop liver disease, or significant liver disease, rather. So what have other parts of the world done? Well, in India, Section 3D of their Patent Act allows for pre- and post-grant opposition to the patents, and at the moment, the decision of their patent authorities is that sofosbuvir not be granted a patent. The reason they've given is somewhat surprising. They talked about lack of efficacy data, and it's being challenged in the courts, but there are other grounds that other patents might be found lacking. And I want to leave you now with this bit that you won't be able to read the details of. This is Unitaid's assessment of the hepatitis C market, published in 2013. This tiny ring in the middle was the only drugs that were available, apart from pegylated interferon and ribavirin, that were on the market at that stage. So on the green side was the peg and ribavirin, on the other side was boceprevir, which was just about the only thing that was available in 2013. Since then, we've seen 2 additional products, sofosbuvir and AbbVie's Viekira coming to the market. But think of all the others in those rings. These were all in phase 3, phase 2, phase 1 development. They're all going to be coming to the market, and they're all going to make some sort of claim, and they're all going to be priced relative to that $84,000 mark that Gilead set. The number of defined daily doses of biologics that are sold in developed and developing countries are quite different. At the top bars are the developed countries, 7.4 billion DDDs sold in 2013 rather. At the bottom, you'll see the developing countries, the far emerging markets, already 4 billion DDDs of biologicals, but a number of them being what are called non-original biologicals. Some of those would be biosimilars. Some of them predate a biosimilar track. But we've just seen the first biosimilar registered in the United States. We've already got biosimilars in Europe, and many of our far emerging countries are going to have biosimilar tracks. So there are going to be many more of these biologicals, many of them expensive, hitting your markets. And they're more on the way. After a record number of new drugs were approved by the FDA in 2014, and a third to a half of all of these are biological. So on average, the FDA over the last number of years, since has been, between 2005 and 2013, has approved around 25 new chemical entities per year. In 2014, they approved 41. Many of those are going to be cancer and antivirals, respiratory, autoimmune, immunosuppressants, as we saw right at the beginning. We've tried, together with the pharmacists who work within health technology assessment agencies around the world, to look at a new model to optimize the utilization of new medicines and sustain healthcare systems. And we've tried to divide the activities between what happens pre-launch, around the launch, and then post-launch. Because if we sit back and allow these products to come to us with the sort of marketing that we're used to for pharmaceuticals, we are going to be overwhelmed. We're going to get demands. There'll be patient groups, usually funded by the manufacturers, clamoring for access, and they're going to crash absolutely all of our budgets, no matter how rich the country that we come from. So, in conclusion, I want to emphasize what it is that countries have to do, and if they don't do it, they are going to be in trouble. So governments are going to be under pressure to intervene in order to ensure access to medicines, particularly if they truly represent innovations and advances in care. So the first step is to identify the added value provided by newly marketed and expensive medicines. Now that might seem so simple. We look at everything that arrives and say, sure, is it good? Is it as good as the one I've been buying? Why must I buy this one? It's not always that simple. Think of the newer insulins. What data have we got to show that they truly represent an advantage over the older humanized insulins? There are no mortality data. There are no long-term health benefits data. We might know something about postprandial hyperglycemia. Does that really translate into something that you need to pay an additional amount of money for? But this health technology assessment process requires A, access to data, and B, an analytical capacity that requires strengthening in many of our settings. We all look at NICE and say, that's the model. How big is NICE? What's the capacity in the universities that underpin what NICE is doing? What about the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network and some of their work? What is EGWIG doing in Germany? Can we try and expand that? Even the Americans under the Affordable Care Act are beginning to look at comparative efficacy data. But we also then need those tools. The means available to governments that wish to intervene to improve access to these medicines are limited, in particular when local laws have not been updated to use all of the flexibilities that are provided for in international agreements. And the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement under the World Trade Organization is a key one. If you do not have the ability to use those flexibilities under TRIPS to allow parallel importation, for example, and yet you've given monopoly rights to someone, you're going to be stuck without the ability to find a more affordable option. If your government use or compulsory license provisions involve a long-winded court case, then you are going to have patients who die waiting for you to be able to afford those medicines because you're unable to intervene correctly. So my message to you at the end is, don't let this lie. In the same way as the old medicines are disappearing and we've got shortages, we at the very, very same time have to deal with this new tsunami of new and expensive medicines that are hitting us and the demands from our populations for access to these. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have actually 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So if you have a question or comment, please come to the mic. We have 3 mics on this side and 3 mics on the other side. No question?
And if there's anyone who wants to know what an ISA is, come to the workshop tomorrow.
You have a question? I don't know if we have a remote mic, or if you can please. Yeah, if you can speak loudly or go to the mic there, whatever you prefer.
It is 11,000 sterling for 28 tablets only. This is approved in December 2013. In January next year, we started to receive orders or requests. Because the patients also, this it is a breakthrough, we know it is a breakthrough. The patient also, they are now knowing and following this and the doctors. Now, this price is very expensive, 11,000 for 28. This is not the cost, I think, for the production or it is the cost for the patents and these clinical trials. Is there any influence by the FDA to reduce or to give a reasonable price, or it is open for this critical item to the company to fix the price since it is patented for maybe 15 years? Thank you.
Okay. So looking particularly at the situation within the US, the FDA has absolutely no role whatsoever in the pricing of medicines. The US government also has a limited ability to use even its own buying power to exert a downward pressure on prices. The only thing they've got is a provision that says the Veterans Administration and the Indian Health Service must get the best price that's offered within the US. But if the company sells to everyone for the same price, that's the price the VA and the IHS will pay. The Torsen clause that was put into the Affordable Care Act says that for Medicare, and it went in before into the Medicare Part D ambulatory extension, the US government may not use its buying power to exert a downward pressure on prices, so its hands are tied. It can't even do what other governments can do. What we've seen so far within the US market is that the large pharmaceutical benefit management firms that are running mail order pharmacy for ambulatory care have used their buying power to negotiate discounts. So Express Scripts went with one, CVS went with the competitor product. The key is that the extent of the discount is confidential. So the power stays with the supplier, and the rest of us can't even use that information to say, look, this is the price that you gave. In the case of Egypt, Gilead gave them a 90% discount because they've got the largest number of patients. We don't know what will happen outside of Egypt or whether we can use that price in negotiations and say to Gilead, we know what you've sold it to Egypt for, can't we get close to it? What they've also done is license voluntarily a number of generic firms in India to make copies using the originator Gilead active pharmaceutical ingredient, but they've restricted the countries that those products can be sold in. So as part of that voluntary license, they can only be sold into low-income and least developed countries. So the problem is often in middle-income and upper-middle-income countries that have the capacity to identify and are dealing with those patients. In the countries that can get the lowest price, there's no diagnosis and the patients die without ever getting to treatment. So it's kind of an exercise in futility. But let's take the history from HIV. In 2000, we were paying between 10 and 15,000 US dollars per year for antiretrovirals. with global action, with concerted efforts, with embarrassing those firms, with a lot of voluntary and compulsory licensing, we've brought that price down to $150 per patient per year. So there is a way forward. It's going to take lots of countries working together. At Unitaid, which is an innovative financing mechanism, what we've done is we've funded a consortium built around the old HIV patient organizations to try and attack these patents, and we're working with the Lawyers Collective in India also to try and see whether there is a better reason to refuse the patent and reduce that monopoly power that Gilead has. But I think what we're going to see, we've so far only got Gilead and AbbVie. What we haven't got yet is a pan-genotypic all-oral triple combination. When that comes along, there'll be a lot more competition. We should see the prices coming back. $84,000 is just plain crazy. But bottom line, the end of that long answer, Hep C is only one disease. What about Pompe? What about cancers? What about ranibizumab for wet macular degeneration? There are so many other very, very expensive medicines. So we can't just think of one disease. We've got to think of all of them.
And from the biotechnology standpoint, we're going to start seeing what they're referring to as one-and-done drugs. So a drug that you give to a person once, and it'll cure a disease. It'll wipe out parts of their bodies that cause these things. There's some in development, for example, for sickle cell. $84,000 may be cheap compared to some of the prices that we'll see on some of these drugs, but if you look at the cost of treating a patient over their lifetime, it's probably 2 or 3 times more, if not more than that, than the cost of the drug. But the question is who pays for that up front when the cost over the lifetime? And that's part of our just system that we're going to have to figure out is how do we pay for these drugs now, because it's going to save the costs to the patient, to our health systems over their whole life.
Okay, thank you. I don't see other people. They have questions. Oh, okay. No? So, 2 questions here.
Thank you very much. My question is to Professor Christine. It's about training and competency. Now we are attending an event which we used to attend it annually. And also at the regional levels, some activities will be there. But we cannot, in continuing education, we cannot rely on such events. We need a certain type of continuing CPD, through which we can assure the sustainability of knowledge. And here I mean the basic knowledge of pharmacology and maybe some certain pharmaceutical aspects like stability, safety, efficacy, and something like that. I want to ask about how can we tailor a program, a continuing program, through which we can sustain the knowledge and the competency.
I'm not sure if you're asking like on a local level or a national level, but that's one of the issues that we're trying to identify is what are some of those competencies?
At the hospital, hospital level.
Okay, then at the hospital level, you will want to identify what competencies you expect your pharmacists to demonstrate. And this may actually get into credentialing and privileging within a given site. But if you have someone performing maybe in a pediatric area, or if you have them performing on the floor, there's certain things that you're expecting them to do as far as their daily medication reconciliation, their medication therapy monitoring, but there's certain areas that you want them to be doing. What I've seen is some systems that they do peer review to give assessment in some key competency areas that they've identified. So the group that you're working in gives the person feedback to assure that they're able to perform. I've seen some systems that they have a physician oversight But I will say personally, I don't know how a physician should be judging a pharmacist for their role. I think their role in some areas, but we really do need our own infrastructure within pharmacy to say these are some of the key areas from a competency standpoint. There's a lot of areas we can assess competency in, and as far as the pharmacy department, you need to look at what's important. You may identify given areas for a given year. That was one focus that we had when the Joint Commission was looking at us, is they'd ask us about competency assessment. How did you identify the areas of competency, and how were you assessing your staff's competency in those areas? And often it was, we would look at the staff's role in a high-risk procedure. So it might be their responses on code, for example. When they responded to a code blue is what we referred to our critical situations. Or it might be their competency in preparing chemotherapy, or just some specific areas. But we identified some high-risk areas, and it varied by each year to make sure our pharmacists were competent to perform in those given areas. And some was just some standards, most of it was also with observation, to make sure they not only could, on paper, show what they were doing, but also perform that at the bedside.
Okay. Do you have
Can
comments?
I add to that one? I think what you're also looking for is the means to deliver that CPD. And I think one-off events like this can be used to top up and polish and show people what their gaps are. But within a hospital, you've got to invest in online resources, because you can't take people